Hi, welcome to this episode of West Trade Review's PostScript interview series. My name is Melanie Pierce, and I'm an associate fiction editor at West Trade Review. And I'm excited to be joined today by Corley Longmire, whose short story, The Right Kind of Animal, will be published in our online winter 2021 issue. Corley Longmire recently graduated with her master's from the Center for Writers at the University of Southern Mississippi. Her fiction can be found in Barely South Review, Stoneboat, and it's forthcoming in Brink and the Westchester Review. She currently works on the editorial team at University Press of Mississippi. Corley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, great. So, of course, I'm eager to talk about your story that we're publishing, The Right Kind of Animal. But I just want to start with some more general questions, just by learning more about your writing and your practice and just generally getting to know you. So I just want to start with, how did you come to be a writer?
I was always one of those kids who was telling stories, and I was the one who was writing sequels to films because they didn't have sequels, and I didn't like the ending. I didn't want it to end. So that was my first, experience with writing. And then as I got a little bit older, I had to write a book for a fifth grade project. That was my first experience with deadlines and understanding, okay, you have to have this draft done by then. And I complained about it the entire time, but I loved writing it. And then as I got older, I continued loving to read and tell stories and write. And I got to the point halfway through my undergrad experience, I was transferring from community college to a four-year university and trying to figure out what I wanted to major in. And I ended up going into English, focusing primarily on literature, but then taking creative writing workshops, getting experience with that, and getting to work with some really phenomenal fiction writers, as well as poets. A couple of years passed, I'm working, just trying to figure out what I want to do. And I realized that I wanted to go back to school and, get more experience with writing. So that's when I enrolled in the master's program at USM in 2019. Just continued telling stories and kind of figuring out who I am as a storyteller and what I wanted to tell, the stories that were kind of calling to be told. And through that experience, those 2 years, my writing changed dramatically. My approach to writing changed, but I continue to love writing and exploring different genres of writing and just, trying new things.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like your inclination to explore other genres kind of pops up in the story we're publishing, so we can talk about that later. So it's interesting to hear about your kind of trajectory of your writing. So what does your writing practice look like today? I know that you obviously work at the University Press of Mississippi. So, and I'm also always so interested when writers have writing adjacent day jobs. So I'd also be interested to hear about, if your editorial work informs your creative practice and vice versa.
I will go on and address that straight away. It does not. I really love the work that I do with the editorial department, because what's been great about that is I'm not just working on one particular thing. I'm jumping around from project to project and getting to work on all these different aspects of publishing that I never really considered as much. So for instance, working on an index, looking at making sure margins are set up correctly. It's these small details that when you're reading a book, you're not really conscious of, but when you notice an error, it really stands out. And I'm kind of working behind the scenes, locating those errors and kind of figuring out how to best adjust them and what changes are needed to be made. But with the work that I'm doing, usually we're publishing literary criticism or conversation books with different authors. So it's really interesting because while we're not publishing fiction or poetry, I'm still getting experience and getting kind of immersed in different types of writing, different writers. And it's been really interesting because I'm jumping again, from project to project, learning more about all these different types of, whether there's literary criticism or, different authors and what they're interested in, what pushes them to write, what drives them. So it's been really great working with the press. That being said, since I've started working there, I've noticed that my writing kind of has changed a little bit. And I think that's been actually for the better. because thinking back to, again, I was just in a master's program for 2 years. Over half of that was done during the pandemic and entirely remotely, which was quite an adjustment, but it was great. It was great. And when the pandemic happened, I noticed that my experience with writing, it seemed to kind of be the opposite of what a lot of my cohorts was, and that whereas they were kind of struggling to write at times, I was writing almost nonstop. And at the back of my mind the entire time, I was worried about burnout. I was worried, what if I kind of use everything up? And I was really just getting into a kind of a bad mind space that was, always kind of creeping up on me, feeling, a bit overwhelmed. And when I started this new job, it allowed me to kind of take a step back and kind of remind myself that while I am a fiction writer, that's not all I am. So it's been interesting trying to balance out work with fiction writing, trying different genres of writing, and then also just life in general, and kind of, taking a step back from academia, which I've been in for 2 years now, and just kind of getting back into life. So the writing process has kind of changed at this point. I'm not writing as much every day as I might have been. Although I've never typically been a writer to write every day. I kind of jump around and have like big spurts of creativity where I'll get something out in a couple of days, take a month or two away from that, and then come back to it. But I'm always kind of writing little snippets of things, whether it's, a story idea or a line that comes to me that I might can turn into something else.
Cool. So if you were writing more during the pandemic, is solitude something that helps you produce more, or what do you think what it was about the pandemic that helped you be so productive?
I think solitude is actually a really interesting look at that, because my master's thesis, when I was working on the introduction for that, I was focusing on isolation. And coming back from where I was at in Hattiesburg, Mississippi for graduate school, I moved back home. And it was such an adjustment because I was so used to going out and seeing friends and doing things. And where I'm currently at, there's not a whole lot around. It's a very small town, very rural. So it was an adjustment because I was moving from a place where I was always in something to a place where it's more about being in me and kind of figuring out, what I was doing and what stood out to me as interesting, as changing. And so it gave me the chance to really consider myself and my place and what kind of, motivates me to write on a daily basis. And I think it was that solitude that really did influence my writing, because it had an impact on not only my writing, but my mindset. And, with me still being here, I've been writing a good bit in the last, year and a half. But also I've noticed since, going out and being able to do more as, the pandemic has lessened at times, as it's kind of changed and fluctuated. My writing has changed in response to that. If I'm going out more, maybe I'm not writing quite as much, quite as manically. Whereas if I'm home more and kind of just, alone, not really interacting with people, it's more like I'm looking inward and kind of considering, the ideas and the characters and the stories that I can tell.
Yeah, that's interesting. And this is a great segue into my next question. I wanted to ask you about the Southern roots of your writing. So you grew up in Southern Mississippi, right? That's where you are now. So obviously, there's a long tradition of fiction coming out of the South. So I just wondered if you could talk about how the South has influenced your writing, if there are Southern writers that are big influences for you, just what you think about place in writing in general.
I'm going to be bad and say that Southern writing honestly doesn't influence me as much, which I find hilarious. Especially like, again, thinking back to grad school and people talking about, a lot of writers from Mississippi like Faulkner and Welty. And I'm just sitting here like, I don't typically read them, but, let's go with it. But Southern writing in general, I feel like my roots as, being from Southwest Mississippi, growing up again, very rural, it's very much influenced how I do write, because a lot of stories I read sometimes, I'm always looking for that spark of the author. Like if I know the person who's written a story, I'm always kind of looking to see if there's a bit of place in their piece that, kind of connects to them. And a lot of times it does, but then other times maybe the story isn't focused as much on place. I think I am a very place-based writer. But the fiction I read is typically not so much focused on Mississippi itself. It's kind of, all over the place. It's looking at different locations. So I'm familiar with Jesmyn Ward, and I've read several of her essays. I've never read a novel of hers, though, which again, it makes me feel like a bad Mississippian to say that, but she's on my radar for sure. But reading her work and like looking at how she looks at living in Mississippi versus like, how I do as, a white woman, it's interesting again to look at how, the way that you're brought up and what you grow up and the culture that you exist in, it definitely does affect the way that you, react to place, the way that you write about it. But kind of looking at that with like, again, my relationship to place and like this story, definitely the history of, I guess hunting, for instance, it very much played a part in this. And so I was kind of drawing on experience with family and friends and kind of considering how to, fictionalize that for a piece like this.
Cool. This is a good, also, we're going to just shift into talking about your piece now, The Right Kind of Animal. So I want to give our viewers a quick summary of your story. In this story, a 13-year-old girl goes deer hunting in winter with her father. She's not particularly interested in killing an animal, but her father insists. In their extended family, hunting is not only a favorite pastime, but also the way they seem to measure a person. The fact that the girl hasn't killed a deer yet is a source of contention between her and her father, and while she agrees to go hunting this day, she deploys a series of small rebellions during their trip. The Right Kind of Animal is a coming-of-age story about nature, agency, gender, and the lengths we'll go to for parental approval. So I want to start by asking, how did this story come to you? What was the seed of the story? How were you inspired to write this?
The bridge for the story, it's actually very interesting because it came from a much larger work in progress that I've been working on for about a year now. And it was entirely different, though. The only thing really that stayed the same was that there were two characters hunting, and it was kind of focusing on this reluctance to kill a deer. I was struggling with that piece, though. Originally, the characters in it was two brothers. And I had kind of like the bones of what I wanted that scene to be. And it just stood out to me as the strongest scene in this piece that I've since kind of shelved for the time being. But I was looking at that and wondering, what I could do with this if I could make it into a story. And one of my committee members at my thesis defense advised me, to try writing shorter because for the longest time I've been a writer of longer stories. So getting this chance to kind of take this very brief scene from this longer work and turn it into something that's still brief but tells a full story was a really interesting challenge for me, and I loved getting to do that. So I kind of changed some things up, changed out the daughter and the father character, put them in. And a large part of that was, again, thinking about my relationship with my father, because like the father in this, he only has girls. I have, it's just me and my sister, and this, this character, she's an only child, the only daughter. But whereas like my father has never tried to, kind of indoctrinate me with these masculine ideals. It's very much different in this story. And that was something I wanted to look at, is how, sometimes, it's, we a lot of times see in fiction and in real life, the way that parents kind of respond to gender and children and like their expectations of them. So I really wanted to write about that because, it's something that I find, quite compelling in real life and again in fiction. And so kind of looking at that and this idea of hunting, which I have never been deer hunting, oddly enough. But it's something that's always really interested me, is this idea that by killing a deer, by having this trophy, whether it's, a rack of antlers or something else, it's kind of like a sign of your worth that you have kind of conquered this challenge. And then, the spreading of blood on your face, it's this rite of passage that I've never understood because I've never actually done it. So I really wanted to kind of consider the stories I've heard firsthand about hunting, experiences with it, and kind of, shift it around a bit, kind of bend it to my will and see what I could do with it.
That's super interesting. So the heart and blood, like you were just talking about, that's all part of this rite of passage that you're capturing in the story. And the heart also becomes, kind of a focus image in your piece. So if you could just talk about how you landed on that image and what the image of the heart means to you in this story. I was reading another piece of yours this morning that's in Stone Boat. And that story also ends on a beating heart. That's like in the last line. So it seems like this is an image that comes up a lot in your work. So could you just talk about that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for reading that. That's super sweet.
Oh, yeah.
I've noticed a lot of times I kind of have an image or a theme that crops up in my pieces without me being aware of it at the time. So for instance, in some of my other stories that I've worked on, a friend of mine commented once, she was like, you write characters who are runners. They're trying to escape something or go to something. And it was something I'd never thought about. And kind of similarly with the heart imagery, it was something I didn't think about until after I'd written this and was looking back at some of my other projects. And I think it's because, we have a physical heart, but we also have like the metaphorical heart and, ideas of romance and love, whether, again, it's romantic love or, familial love. There's all these different ideas that are associated with hearts and, history and fiction. And so it's something that I really like to play with because, and one draft I wrote, and I honestly can't remember if it made it into this one, it was looking at the idea of how hearts, they work so hard, but something as simple as, in this case, a bullet. And maybe that's not simple. Let's change that wording. But something like that, it can, instantly cause dramatic damage. And it's this idea of strength and weakness that has always fascinated me, that I like to kind of play with and see, what direction I want to go in with writing about it, looking at, hearts in the physical sense, but also in the sense that for this character who's killing a deer, shooting it through the heart, also considering her heart and the relationship she has with her father and how, it's the small things that he does that are so impactful, that hurt so much, but yet it's also small things that he does that in this case can kind of, salve that ache. So it was kind of looking at like these two ideas of a heart and juxtaposing them to seeing what could come of it.
Cool. Yeah. So in the ending of this story, the character holds a buck's heart in her hands, and the story almost seems to kind of veer into like horror-esque story. So I just want to go back to what you were saying earlier about exploring different genres. Was genre bending something that you were actively thinking about when you were writing this story, or did that kind of element at the end just kind of organically make its way in?
That was honestly one of the early scenes that I had when I decided to make this into a full story. I believe I was out on a walk just because usually if I'm struggling with ideas or trying to find inspiration, I'll go outside and, kind of just walk through, get some of that manic energy out and see what comes of it. And that image of a young girl holding a heart and considering the idea of what taking a bite of it might do, it kind of came to mind, and everything else sprung from that. But as I thought on it more, I could definitely feel, that other pieces I've read have definitely inspired that. So for instance, I read Samantha Hunt's short story collection, The Dark Dark, a couple of years ago. And in one of the stories, and possibly in more than one, I'm trying to remember, but there's a woman in it, and at different points, she turns into a deer. And it was kind of this idea of humanity versus, the animal world, and like kind of considering what's inside versus like how that's projected outside, looking at that and these kind of like evolutions and, how we kind of look at ourselves differently and what it, even in certain fiction like that, where it's kind of playing with themes of horror and magical realism, like what is this moment saying about the character? What are we getting from that? And so kind of channeling ideas of that and, evolution, kind of like a dramatic shift and change. I wanted to look at that and have this character imagining, in this moment when she is so grounded in herself, what something else, could allow her to become, where she's not tied to her physical body, where she's not tied to the hurts that come with that. And I think that's something we all wonder at some point, and considering ways of escape, whatever that might be. And I really wanted to kind of challenge myself by looking at the perspective of a young girl, which I was once, kind of calling back on that, my experience with, growing up, family perceptions and kind of their expectations, and as well as, like, again, not feeling right in my own skin, and kind of considering how I could kind of think about these issues and contextualize them for this character and how she would cope with them.
That's also interesting. And I feel like that's such a good place to stop. But I do have one more question that I really want to ask you. So the point of view of this story is second person, and the story that I was reading of yours this morning is second person as well. So how did you decide to use second person as the point of view in this story? And is that kind of your go-to point of view?
For go-to point of view, typically it's third, honestly. But something I've realized is that I feel like writing second person is easier, as opposed to like first or third, because I'm able to kind of situate the reader in the character I'm writing. And for some reason, I'm able to also situate myself in a different way than when I'm writing first person. So it's really worked out and been a really nice exercise in writing second person. And I know a lot of times we hear things about how second person stories perhaps don't do as well, or they're not as, readable or desirable. But I think they have a lot of merit. And getting to write that for this perspective, I think the one reason I chose to write it in second is because first would have felt too close to home. And third would have been interesting. And actually, a friend of mine who was reading a draft of this and helping me revise mentioned perhaps writing it in a different perspective just to see if anything would change, if I would have new inspiration, or if a characterization might come out in the daughter or the father. And it was a really interesting idea. So I tried that out, to learn new things about what I was wanting to write, and then went straight back to second person, because most of the time when I'm writing, I can tell right away the perspective that it's going to be. Sometimes it might change a little bit, but usually if I write it in a certain perspective, the revised and finalized version is going to be the same. But with this, again, I think it was the idea of writing a character and almost having like a story told to the reader, like you were doing this, you were doing that, things like that. But also kind of grounding them in this moment of having this kind of intimate moment between, the father and the daughter. And that was a goal of mine as well, is because I feel like with second person, there is an intimacy. It's not, there might even be like a claustrophobic aspect that I find really fascinating. Also a little unsettling, depending on what I'm writing about. In this case, I think there's a lot of emotional value in second person, because I was trying to draw that out of this character in a way that I feel like would be different had I done it in third or first.
That's interesting. I liked that you used second person in this story because I felt like it put some cognitive distance between the narrator and her father, and what he's telling her to do and what she's telling herself to do. There was some really interesting kind of overlap there. And I like how second person kind of zeroed in on that. I thought that was cool. Yeah. So would you like to read your short story for us?
Yes, I'd love to. The right kind of animal. Dad makes you zip your jacket up before he takes you hunting. Where you were generally flat before, hips and breasts have blossomed in the last year, and growing into your body, it makes it difficult for him to see you as anything but a girl. Always he's treated you like your boy cousins. That's not so easily done anymore. You're wearing the new sports bra Mom bought beneath the camo, so tight it cinches your ribs. The pain's good, better than having him comment on your weight. Mom says to shake it off. He's a man, baby. You know how they are. You do as Dad says and close the jacket, zipper resting over your heart, but shake your head when he passes you a cap. Your hair will get in the way, he tells you. I can pull it back. You won't. You intend to leave it hanging over your shoulders where he can't help but see. Dad spits tobacco juice into the grass and barely looks at you. One more little wound. Better not whine about it later. There are a few colors this deep in winter, except brown and blue. It rarely snows in Mississippi, but the cold sets into the land, the lakes, your bones. Inside the deer blind, you try to match your breathing to Dad's. He's so quiet. He's done this all his life, and thus you have too, even when you didn't want to, even though you've never shot anything but targets. That remains a sore spot with him whenever your uncles and grandfather bring it up. When's your kid gonna kill a deer? Today, if Dad has his way. Not that you've made it easy for him. When he woke you at 5 o'clock, you lay in bed until he tired of checking to see whether you were up. He fixed a thermos of coffee you've refused to share with him. Not hungry, you said when he scooped scrambled eggs onto your plate. Small rebellions. You sneak a thumb to your wrist and beg your pulse to stop being so loud because Dad says animals can hear it just as well as they can smell the danger scent of people. The buck is big in a way you can't describe, barely 100 yards away and coming nearer. Antlers growing in, not yet like the chandelier-sized racks Dad mounts. The deer weaves between bushes, easily lost amidst the brown-black trees, movements languid. He hasn't scented you yet. Nose to earth, he roots for the pecans that litter the ground. Soon, he's so close you can see veins bulging beneath his pelt. Your heartbeat throbs in your ears, your throat, inside your thigh. Dad straightens. He can't hear your heartbeat. He's not the right kind of animal for it, and he eases the rifle toward your empty hands. When you don't immediately take it, he waits. There are only so many times he'll accept you saying no. You try to find comfort in the familiar press of wood and metal when you accept the gun, the scope digging into the socket of your eye, the stock cradled against your shoulder. Trail the buck, line up the shot. You've known where to aim, what kind of death is merciful, since you were 7. In the moments between its life and death, you swear the buck sees you. Then its body jerks with the force of your bullet, and it crashes down. Pain ratchets through your shoulder from the kickback. The hand Dad claps to your back only makes it worse. His fingers get caught in your hair, not quite enough to hurt. Good shot, he says. You wish you weren't hungry for his praise, but it fills some of the cracks in your heart he inadvertently made in the first place. At home under the carport, Dad hangs the body to dress. He sighs long-sufferingly, but complies when you refuse to pull the skin loose. You're still helping, he says. You can't kill something without getting your hands dirty. Isn't right. Offal slops into buckets. You toss the dog small pieces and pack the meat to be processed. Blood turns your fingernails poppy bright, your wrist wrapped in gore. Mom comes out long enough to bring you both drinks. She doesn't complain about the blood you smear on the glass or that's soaked into the cuffs or your sleeves. Dad says the antlers aren't worth keeping. You don't argue. You've never needed a trophy. Once finished with the carcass, he wets his fingers in blood. You know what to expect from old photographs, from watching your boy cousins go through this ridiculous ritual, and you try not to flinch away as Dad brushes his thumbs under your eyes and across your forehead. The blood quickly goes tacky and smells like old keys. Leave it, he tells you. A rite of passage, the sign that you've killed your first deer. You don't tell him that at 13, you're intimately familiar with blood. While Dad finishes cleaning up, you hold the deer's heart in your hands. It's lighter than expected and cool to the touch. You dig your finger into the dark hole until you find the bullet lodged inside. Bits of muscle wedged beneath your fingernails as you pry the bullet loose. Slimy and stained red, a reminder of what you did today and never want to do again. You set the bullet aside and cradle the heart. Wonder what it would be like to bite into something so recently alive and feel the gush of blood on your tongue clinging to your teeth. Maybe you'd be able to shake off your skin and grow antlers, take on an animal heart. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you for reading. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Just a reminder that West Trade Review is on all of the social medias, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And you can like this video, of course, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to read Corley's story, The Right Kind of Animal, in our forthcoming winter issue. Thank you so much, Corley. This was lovely.
Thank you for having me, Melanie.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks.